And I know typically for many of you, you come to Freedom's Foundation here at Valley Forge to actually be on the campus and do face-to-face learning. But obviously that can't really happen this year. And if you're new to us, just a quick synopsis of the foundation. We were founded in the late 1940s, beginning around 1965 here on campus, but even a few years before that off campus, we began to run graduate accredited professional development for teachers. Obviously this summer, with everything being face-to-face, we're not doing the usual accreditation. We're doing, just certificates with hours, but we have traditionally, carried graduate credits with the program. Currently, we're accredited through LaSalle University in Philadelphia. But we've been doing this quite literally for decades, and you are part of a cohort of teachers that now probably, doing the quick math, surpasses about 14,000 teachers. We also do a lot with students. And in fact, students are probably well over in the hundreds of thousands. I forget the exact number, but we've been involved in promoting civic education and civic engagement for all these years. So with that, that's sort of the purpose of offering the sort of professional development that we do. And specifically, topics like that of this particular program of, the presidency and electoral politics. Just a couple housekeeping rules. We have everybody's microphone and camera muted. And we do that just to avoid distraction, because we in fact do record each session. So if you miss a session, I know I already got a couple questions from teachers. If you miss a session, we will have those available for you. Just a little bit of patience, because my colleague Jen Madden actually does a little editing and turns those around and gets them out to you, or makes them available to you. So, if you miss something, we can get you access to it. It just may take, you may not get it till the end of the day or the next day, but it will be there. If you have questions at any time, please use the chat function. I'll be monitoring that to help our speakers out. If you could please make sure it's your actual name up there, because we do take roll. So, if you don't have your proper name up there, we have to try and figure out who you are. And we want to make sure everybody gets, proper hours. And that's actually easy to fix if you don't know how to do it. You just go over to, if you click on participants and you go over to the little camera next to your name and hover over it, it'll come up as one of the menu options to rename. And you can do that. But anyhow, if you do that, so we can make sure we get you your appropriate attendance hours. So the housekeeping's out of the way. Oh, one more thing. If you do run into difficulties in terms of technology, you can go into the chat function and specifically reach out to Jen Madden, who's the tech person, or stay on after the session and Jen will help anybody with tech problems. Okay, so with all that housekeeping out of the way, it is my pleasure to actually introduce an old friend, John Kenneth White, who's professor of politics at the Catholic University of America. He actually co-authored a book that you'll meet the other author this afternoon, Matt Kerbel, called Party On, Political Parties from Hamilton and Jefferson to Trump. And that is probably, what do I want to say, John, your 8th book?
Oh my goodness, Gene, it's a lot of them.
But you'll also see John turn up in publications such as The Hill and other media outlets, and maybe at certain times even on CNN and some of these other places. Over the years I've caught him. But with that, I will submit the floor to John, who's going to talk to us about the nationalization of party politics.
Thank you very much, Gene, and thank you all for being here. And more importantly, thank you for what you do. And engaging young students in politics. This is a very interesting time in our history, and I know for my students here in Washington, the interest in the election, upcoming election, I think is profound. So let me run through a few items. I already see one question in the chat as to how long the class is today. So let's just run through the schedule very briefly. You should have it. Today, I'm going to talk about the nationalization of parties and party organizations. It's a big transformation in our politics, and it's been going for some way, and that includes how we nominate presidents, which I want to go through with you folks today. We have a break, a half-hour break at 12:30, and then from 1 to 2:30, Matt Kerbel, professor of politics from Villanova, will speak. And the schedule is basically the same for the rest of the week. That is going from 11 to 12:30 with a break, and then 1 to 2:30. So we have two speakers tomorrow. Then on Wednesday, we'll talk about the presidency and governing. And then on Thursday, we're going to look at this whole question of money in politics. And then Friday, we'll be looking at the presidential coalitions, those in history, but more importantly, those that seem to be taking shape right now. So that is the structure of how we're going to do things. And before I start the lecture, I know as a teacher myself, I always want to know what materials I can use in my classroom, and particularly, of course, things that are free. Jen and Jean Hallis have put up in the classroom a list of websites, but I want to briefly call your attention to a couple of them that I find extraordinarily useful here, starting with Political Wire, which I think you can see on your screen. And what we've done for this class, and there is information, this is a free website, but if you join, normally for $60 a year, you get additional material, exclusive analysis, I'll run through that, an automatic subscription through the site to Inside Elections, and their unique analysis, all without the advertising. I look at this website several times a day. It's great if you can look at it once a day. And the thing I like about this is you see how nicely things are presented, so they're in brief paragraphs. And if you want, you can then click on a link that gives you more detailed information. This is a nonpartisan website. It's run by a fellow named Tegan Goddard in New York. He's done it for years and years and years and years. And you can also see on the right-hand side the trending news, again, from a variety of news sources. And at the very top, what I really there are some resources here. So you can see, for an example, a consensus electoral map, but it's an interactive map. So, you can play around with this. You can make, you can make Texas red, for example. You can go through various scenarios. You can have your students do this as well, because of course, as we know, the electoral map is the one that really matters. The other thing that I liked under resources, they had a political dictionary. And so you can see, for example, trending terms like rhino, meaning Republican in name only. And you can see, a political dictionary that goes from A to Z here, which is really quite great. And again, for the members, this is what you'll get. So thanks to my friend Tegan Goddard, information is up at the classroom website for a special discount for you folks for the year. And again, it's something you can use in the classroom and show your students. I'm big on this site because I really do like it. And it's changed in the last couple of minutes, so you can see they'll promote certain books, but you can see new polling in the states and whatnot. So it's all really good stuff. The other things I just want to point out to you, one is you, and some of you may be familiar with this. Everything else I'm going to show you is free, but Politico is another great website. Again, it's all devoted to politics and the presidency and the election. So you can see the headlines here. There is advertising that goes with it, but that comes with the territory. This is on a syllabus, by the way, that's also posted in the classroom function, because every 4 years I teach a course on the campaign. So the other one I want to just call to your attention is something called Axios. And what you can do here is you could sign up. I like Axios AM. It comes at 6 o'clock in the morning. It's 10 quick things that are driving the news or politics here in Washington. And it's great. And again, it's really brief. I know your time is limited, but do take a look at that. And I'll try in the future to show you an example. Another one is a US, if you have your students, writing about elections, maybe you want to have them look at either current elections that have happened, or what I like about this is that you can look at elections in history. So you can look at, here's the 2016 election, here's the electoral map. They reverse actually red and blue, which I don't like, but they do that. But you can do this going back, all the way back here, you'll see in history, right up through, right from the start at 1789. So if we click on that, here you see the electoral vote margin for George Washington, right? And then the various runner-ups and so forth. So it's a nice historical website, which again, I like, and again, you can look at it by state. Just really handy resource, I think. Hang on a second. First Read by NBC News is very nice. See where I can click on the link here. You can again sign up for this. It's a brief read. It's run by Chuck Todd of Meet the Press and Mark Murray. And they just give a very short synopsis of the political news. It's not lengthy at all. Comes in your mailbox early in the morning. I get it. Again, everything I'm showing you is free. Another one that you may be familiar with is...
Don, I don't think you're sharing your screen. So just so you're aware, if you're wanting them to see stuff. So go to your command and click on share screen. Down the bottom, the menu.
Yeah, I see it, and it's on. Do you see one participant can share at a time? That's checked.
Hold on a second.
Do I have to do advanced options?
No, hold on one second. Let me see here what's going on.
Oh, wait. Maybe I just have to do multiple participants. I'm so sorry.
No, I just made sure you have full host control. All you should have to do, hold on. There you go. You're good.
I'm so sorry, people.
That's okay.
Do I need to go back a little bit quickly?
No, just keep going, and it, everybody's going to get a list of all the sites afterwards.
Yeah.
So.
Okay, good. Well, I think you can see now Real Clear Politics. That's really a really nice website. And you can see again, here are all the articles and whatnot. And I just have one more to show you, but take a look at these folks when you can, on your own. The last one is a nice one. Hang on here. Um, Thank you, Gene, for clearing that up for me. It's called 270. Wait a minute. Sorry. 270 to win. Doesn't seem to be working. Let me see if I can get that going. Right. So here it is. 270towin.com. And here is the consensus map that they're looking at as of today. But again, you can do this on your own. Your students can do this, as well. So this is how things look as of July 9. And it looks at the latest polling. So these are all great websites to look at. And again, you can, if you didn't see it before, you can now see Political Wire here on your screen. Make sure that I guess we're good. So with that, let me just get started on this nationalization of politics. And I want to start with actually something that's in the news now, and that is where we have seen Amy Kennedy in New Jersey actually win the Democratic nomination to run for the United States Congress in the fall. Amy Kennedy is the wife of Patrick Kennedy of the Kennedy family. Patrick Kennedy was a member of Congress some years back from Rhode Island. Why start here? Well, first, in that district, a fellow named Jeff Van Drew won as a Democrat in 2018. He switched parties in 2019 that coincided with his disagreement with the impeachment of Donald Trump. And that district was one of the last run by a party boss, a boss named George Norcross. And George Norcross had endorsed Jeff Van Drew, was betrayed by Van Drew, and endorsed a political scientist running for the Democrats named Bridget Harrison. Harrison lost the primary decisively, and the New York Times and other media noted that this may be the last machine to fall, that where the party endorsed candidate does not and did not win. And we've seen that decline of the party machines throughout American history. The parties in the United States, and we're going to go for about 15, 20 minutes, and we're going to take questions. So feel free to have questions ready. The parties in the United States formed very early, and they really formed under the umbrella of Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson. And they formed very early because while the founders had agreement on basic values like freedom, individual rights, and this notion of equality, even though their notions of all three of these things were rather crimped, and they've been expanded over the years. I mean, I can go into that in some detail, but they had a particular disagreement about freedom because they knew that freedom by itself would lead to chaos. It would lead to a state of nature. It would lead to crime and chaos and rampant lawlessness. And so they knew that they had to marry freedom to something. Hamilton wanted freedom to be married to a strong federal government and a strong president. Hamilton basically argued that energy in the executive in the Federalist Papers, he says, energy in the executive is the leading character in the definition of good government. Maybe Hamilton would have liked Donald Trump. Uh, Certainly FDR, Lincoln. He wanted energetic presidents and wanted the president to be empowered because Hamilton had seen what a weak federal government could result in chaos under the old Articles of Confederation. So you needed a strong federal government that could act when necessary, and you needed a strong president. Jefferson believed authority should rest in local government. Jefferson saw the nation as a collection of diverse communities, and that the country was different. We should allow for these differences. Now, as president, Jefferson had opportunities like the Louisiana Purchase, and he exercised enormous power to get it because he spent the equivalent of a year's worth of the federal budget to buy Louisiana, that vast territory, when it became available. And he did it without congressional authority. So Jefferson, in that moment, sort of paid lip service to the idea we ought to let the states decide things. But this was a profound disagreement between Hamilton and Jefferson. Jefferson liked to say that they were opposite in life, they would be opposite in death. And that is largely true. And one of the reasons we have a two-party system is that the parties embrace at different times either Hamilton or Jefferson. The Republican Party, when it started in the 1850s, embraced Hamilton. Democrats were the party of states' rights, embracing Jefferson. That reversed under Franklin Roosevelt. And Ronald Reagan, of course, famously said, government is the problem. So you have this kind of basic divide in our politics. So the formation of parties occurs very early in the country. But people identified with parties not just only for their ideas and their partisanship, but they identified for most of our history with parties locally. The local and state party organizations really, really mattered in American politics. A great book, we'll get this up on the classroom, is called Plunkett of Tammany Hall. And that is a fantastic book. It's by a guy named William Reardon. The chapters are about 2 or 3 pages. Plunkett was the boss of Tammany Hall circa 1900. And this boss, George Washington Plunkett, talked to this New York Times reporter very candidly about how he approached politics. It's a little paperback, it's very inexpensive. My price says $5.95. And I just wanted to read you a couple of excerpts that make this point about how the parties connected and their obligation to the voters locally. Here's Plunkett saying this: "How I gather in the young men. Well, I hear of a young feller that's proud of his voice, thinks he can sing fine. I ask him to come around to Washington Hall, the party headquarters, and join our glee club. He comes, he sings, he's a follower of Plunkett for life. Another young fella gains reputation as a baseball player in a vacant lot. I bring him into our baseball club. That fixes him. You'll find him working for my ticket at the polls the next election day. Then there's the fellow that likes rowing on the river. The young fellow makes a name as a waltzer on his block. Another one is handy with his dukes. I rope them all in by giving them opportunities to show themselves off." And then just another little section here where Plunkett describes his work day briefly. 2 a.m. Aroused from sleep by the ringing of the doorbell, went to the doorbell and found a bartender who asked him to go down to the police station and bail out a saloon keeper who had been arrested for violating the excise law. Furnished bail and returned to bed at 3 o'clock. 6 a.m., awakened by fire engines passing the house. Hastened to the scene of the fire, which according to the custom of the time. And met with the fire sufferers and offered them aid, including a hotel, clothes, fed them, arranged temporary quarters. 8:30 a.m., went to police court, found 6 drunks, secured the discharge of 4 by a timely word with the judge, paid the fines of the other 2. Appeared in district court at 9 a.m. to act as counsel for a widow. 11 a.m., home again. 3 p.m., attended a funeral attended a funeral. I'm just consolidating this. Went conspicuously to the front of the Catholic Church. 7 p.m., went to district headquarters and presided over a meeting of election district captains. 8 p.m., at a church fair. 9 p.m., at the clubhouse again. 10:30, attended a Hebrew wedding reception and dance. Had a handsome wedding present given to the bride. 12 midnight in bed. That's how it worked. That's how the parties were locally, and it worked because the parties had something to give people in return. There's a movie that Gene Hallis is going to make available to you that I love to show my students. It's called The Last Hurrah, and it's based on a novel of the same name. This is an old movie that stars Spencer Tracy. And it shows actually Plunkett being brought to life. It's a fantastic movie. Warning, there's a lot of smoking and smoke-filled rooms in it. But again, it shows the same kind of thing. That was the connection. And what the parties had to give those folks in New York and elsewhere, and it was in rural communities as much as big cities, they had jobs to hand out. They had helpers to hand out. They were the social safety net for people in this long history of the United States, really from the 19th century right through the 20th century. But the parties began to decline. There were attacks on parties, sometimes through legislation. Civil service laws began to strip away patronage. The New Deal added to that because it created all these new administrative agencies. Voters began to be unmoored from parties starting in the 60s and 70s. The party machines at the state and local level began to become passé. The bosses of New York, Chicago, Republican bosses in places like Nassau County in New York and Long Island also began to decline. Staten Island. This was not a Democratic Party urban thing. This was a bipartisan phenomenon. And so what happened as that occurred is that the national parties became ever more important over time. And this actually, when we talk about national parties, let's be clear what we're talking about. So for the Democrats, it's the Democratic National Committee, the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee. So at the national level, you have these. You also do have a Governors Association, but the big ones are the Democratic Campaign, the Democratic National Committee. It's called the DNC, the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, which is the DCCC, and the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee, which is the DSCC. On the Republican side, you have the Republican National Committee, the National Republican Congressional Committee, and the National Republican Senatorial Committee. Okay, so the RNC, the NRCC, and the NRSC. And these committees started to grow in power, and it started with the Republicans back in the 1970s. So I have to explain this story and what happened briefly to you. And that is that in 1976, following Watergate, Jimmy Carter, a Democrat, won the presidency. And when you have someone losing the presidency, as Gerald Ford did, there becomes a contest to see who is going to be the National Party chair. That happens every election. After Hillary Clinton lost, there was a contest within the Democratic National Committee to see who was going to be the chairperson of that organization, which wound up to be a fellow named Tom Perez. So this is typical for out parties. When a party that wins a presidential election, the president names the National Party chair, and there's no disagreement about it. Today, Ronna Romney McDaniel is the RNC chair named by Donald Trump. What happened in the 1970s after Ford lost is that a fellow named Bill Brock became the National Party chair after a contest. And he looked at what had happened, the wreckage of the Nixon presidency, the Ford loss, and decided, rightly, that the Republican Party was in trouble. It hadn't won the control of the House since 1952. It was not in control of the Senate. It had been blown out in the midterm elections of 1974. And it had now lost the presidency. And Brock decided that the National Party must be strengthened, and that the National Party, to be strengthened, needed resources. It needed money, and it needed to be able to collect significant sums of money so that it could provide direct aid to the state parties and their candidates. And what Brock did was he began a direct mail campaign. He began to solicit via the Postal Service, via the mail, Republicans, building a list and asking them to contribute $10, $20, $32. The average contribution was about $30, which, by the way, was great for the Republican Party because the party, since the New Deal, had been known as the party of the fat cats, the rich kids, the party that whose guys had 3 and 4s after their names, and as Kevin Phillips once wrote, dated girls named Muffy and Buffy from Harvard. By having these small dollar contributions, they could attack that we're the party of the rich perception that was out there. And Brock built the list. He got the contributions, and then he invested those into building the list and building the list and building the list. And as he did that, he was able to keep staff turnover very low and give resources to the state parties. He appointed executive directors from Washington to go out to the states to professionalize the state parties. You have workshops for congressional candidates. How do you write a press release? They were able to do polling in some key congressional districts. They were able basically to give something the National Party had never been able to give. 4 years later, after that 1976 loss, Jimmy Carter lost the presidency decisively to Ronald Reagan. And the Democratic Party was in shambles. Jimmy Carter once said of the Democratic National Committee, quote, "It was like an albatross around my neck." It's an unbelievable statement from a president of your own party, but the party was in shambles. They looked at what the Republicans were doing and said they wanted the Republicans. The joke was, stop what you're doing, Republicans, until we can catch up. But the RNC kept raising more money and more money and more investments. And they had a president in Ronald Reagan that invested time and energy into the National Party. So the National Party is building more resources. The National Party is recruiting Democratic members of the House, Senate, and state legislatures to convert to the Republican Party. Ronald Reagan liked to call them baptism ceremonies. And the National Party is recruiting candidates to run for these offices and taking more and more and more of a leadership role, something that intensifies with Newt Gingrich when he becomes House Speaker. So you have all of the national Republican parties, not just the National Committee, but the congressional campaign committees having more resources, more contributions, money that they can then come into a district or state and say, Joe Jones or Mary Smith is our candidate. This is the person we think is best equipped to win in this district. And winning was the thing that mattered. And they also, on the congressional side, expected their leaders to raise large sums of money for their congressional campaign committees. Today in the House, Nancy Pelosi is expected and does raise large sums of money for the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, which chose candidates in places like California, Pennsylvania, and others that, in 2018 that they thought had a really good shot of winning. And they chose candidates in states like Virginia that actually did win in prior Republican districts. So it was all about getting to 218 electoral votes. Democrats eventually caught up, and they caught up under a guy named Terry McAuliffe, who was the DNC chair, later governor of Virginia, a relentless fundraiser. And so what you have now is you've got a massive amount of money, structure, staff at the national level that is doing what local and parties used to do, which is to select candidates to run, to endorse candidates, to help them with resources. Let me give you one example. But the Republican committees, that is the RNC, the NRCC, the NRSC, the House and Senate committees, they raised in 2019 $436 million that calendar year. It will be off the charts in 2020. For the Democrats in 2019, their party committees, the DNC, the DCCC, and the DSCC, a total for all three, they raised $342 million in 2019 alone. And again, all of this is off the charts in 2020. There is a website that's called opensecrets.org, where you can look at the money that these party committees are raising. And there's also another great website, which is the FEC.gov, stands for Federal Election Commission. And you can see both money raised, and you can also search individual contributions and so forth. And the monies, of course, raised by the presidential candidates in 2020 are just astronomical. So Trump raised about $700 million in 2016. Hillary Clinton raised about $1 billion. And we're expecting basically easily a $2 to $3 billion presidential haul in 2020. One last thing I want to mention on this, and then just invite any questions that you have, is that if we look at the formation of these parties, the DNC, the Democratic National Committee, goes back to the 1840s. And there aren't very good historical records kept. The RNC was formed with the Republican Party in 1856, 1860. The congressional committees for the Democrats, that was also very early in the 1840s. It was very much an ad hoc thing, didn't have a lot of money or a lot of power. The Republicans created their congressional committee, the NRCC, in 1866. And that was because Andrew Johnson, a Democrat, was president after the Lincoln assassination. Johnson, as the incumbent president, controlled the Republican National Committee, which really upset House Republicans. And that's when they formed their congressional campaign committee, because they needed something that was going to speak for what they believed the party, not Andrew Johnson, who they did not view as a Republican, and he certainly was not, since he opposed much of Reconstruction. The senatorial committees were formed in the early 20th century after the passage of the congressional amendment allowing senators to be chosen by voters in their states instead of state legislatures. So instead of power flowing from the bottom up to the national parties, it is flowing from the top down today to the national parties. This is almost a permanent phenomenon. I don't see it changing very much in our politics. So we're a long, long way here from Plunkett and the old party machines. Just one quick personal story. In the 1970s, I wrote a book on New England politics, late 70s, early 80s, and I interviewed the party chairs. I'm from Rhode Island, and I went to interview the Democratic state chair back then. And in the waiting room were people looking for jobs. There were kids looking for summer jobs to be a lifeguard. There were others that were looking for jobs at the state prison and so forth. And I was the lone academic among all these job seekers bringing their resumes to the state party chair. That does not happen anymore at all. So you see a weakening of the party organizations, local and state, really across the board, where they're increasingly dependent, on the national parties. If you have a question and want to type it in the chat, I'm happy to do that. Otherwise, I want to go on to the nomination. So there is a good question here on soft money. We're going to get into money later this week. Soft money is basically, this is money that is given in bulk to a party. There are hard money is the strict contributions that are given to candidates regulated by federal law. So the most money any one of you, not that you all have it, can give to a candidate for president in a primary is $2,800. And in the general, you can give another $2,800. What soft money did was it created an outlet to avoid that law, where you can give large sums of money, not to a candidate, but to a political party. That was called soft money. And John McCain and Russ Feingold, both senators at the time, passed legislation called McCain-Feingold that would basically outlaw soft money. And Democrats had become very dependent on soft money. And so Terry McAuliffe, knowing that this was going to happen, took the last bunch of soft money the Democrats were going to get to refurbish the party headquarters. what has happened, so soft money was an attack basically to try to stop this flow of money, not just from individual contributions, which are perfectly legal, but from large groups of people, giving multi-million-dollar contributions to the parties and so forth, where the parties could accept those contributions and then distribute them both to candidates and state parties. The McCain-Feingold basically put that to a stop, but under Citizens United, the Supreme Court decision in 2010, now we have dark money. This is money that's collected by political action committees that is unreported money and can be spent on behalf of candidates as long as there's no coordination between the candidate and the political action committee. So for example, there are Trump super PACs that can collect vast sums of money, all unreported, spend it on behalf of Donald Trump. There are Democratic super PACs doing the same thing, and perhaps soon to be aided by Michael Bloomberg, the ex-mayor of New York, that looks like he's going to form his own super PAC. And Bloomberg could spend easily, as he did in his brief campaign, $100 million advocating for Democrats, as long as he doesn't call Joe Biden and say, where do you guys need the money? Where do you need the advertisements? And we're already seeing, by the way, advertisements from these super PACs for both presidential candidates and others that, again, is outside the regulatory regime Congress passed. Again, all of this brings our politics right back to the top. So great question, Patrick Sprinkle. Hope I answered it. Anything else that you want to get to?
Yeah, John, I just want to interrupt for 1 second. You're seeing the chat?
I see it.
Okay, because you're the host. It's not coming up on my end because you're the host. I just wanted to make sure you see it.
Something I need to do to make it come up on your end?
No, that's fine. As long as you're seeing it, that's good. I do have one question for you out of curiosity.
Yep.
Just and for fun. Did you teach Terry McAuliffe?
No, but Catholic University, as Gene knows, has a number of alumni. Terry McAuliffe was a student at Catholic University back in the 1970s. So was Ed Gillespie, who is a former RNC chair. He was in the 1980s. So was Brian Williams, the anchor, and so was Governor O'Malley of Maryland. They're all Catholic U alumni I can think of off the top of my head, all majoring in politics. So we have a alumnus, by the way, out of our department that runs America Rising. That's the Trump super PAC. And we have another alumnus who is the deputy political director for Joe Biden. So yeah, we get a number of really good students. Other points, or let me move on? Are we good? Oh, Nixon Southern Strategy. Yes, it was, and we're going to get into this on Friday, Ryan Hahn. Thank you for your question. I appreciate it. But to answer it briefly, it was very real, and it was very deliberate, and it really hastened the realignment to the South. By the way, if I, while I'm on this, I'm just going to take a very, since I mentioned 2 websites, let me go to the, and I hope you can see this, right. You should be able to see this, and Gene, you're gonna let me know if they're not. But this is the fec.gov website. And here you can see all of the campaign finance data, the raising and spending of money.
Yeah, are you trying to, did you try to share it?
Yes. Are they seeing it?
No, hold on a second. Let me try one thing. I'm gonna kick it back to you. Try it again.
Did they see it? Yeah, they should see it now, right?
Yep, you're good.
Yeah, so we just go back to their homepage. So this is their homepage. You can see under campaign finance data, all data raising and spending. You can look up contributions by individuals. I love to do this, by the way, at my own university. You can type in employer and see who gave what to whom. It's always fun. Uh, you know, you can look at the if I look at raising here, you can just see, okay, you know, all receipts, individual contributions, etc. You can see how much money is being raised, again, by just setting your parameters, whatever. And all campaigns have to report their by law data, that is individual contributions and their spending, to the Federal Elections Commission. So again, all of that is, you know, hugely, hugely important. So, uh, right. So I can stop the screen share when needed, right? I mentioned one other, and I'll just show you this one as well, opensecrets.org. This is where you, again, you can get a lot of this, you know, information about dark money, political action committees, um, dig into a list of super PACs. So sometimes you get even more information than you would get from the FEC. And it's also a great teaching tool. So you can learn about the basics of campaign finance to show your students, because money and this whole question of the proliferation of vast sums of money now into our politics has really, really, really transformed it. Okay. I'm assuming right now, let me just stop the share. Right. Okay. So now I get back into the screen where you can see everything. Is there the possibility of overturning Citizens United is quite remote at this point. It's going to require changes on the Supreme Court. So I do not see that happening. I think that that is going to be an important, if you have a President Biden, which is an if, as we all know. I do think that if you look at litmus tests for the court, one of them is going to be, I think, a strong commitment to overturn citizens. They can nibble at the edges. A constitutional amendment is almost impossible. It's going to take the court to reverse itself. Is there viability for third parties? Great question. And this year, the answer is no, because we don't seem to have viable third-party candidates, with all due respect to Kanye West and the birthday party, which may be of great interest to some of your students. But what third parties have done in history is they have had their strong moments, and then what happens is that the major parties steal from them. So they appropriate their issues. So for example, Ross Perot was all about managing the deficit, and both the Republicans and Bill Clinton made that an issue. So third parties are like Roman candles. They burn brightly and then they go out. Right. Okay. Let me turn to the, in our time remaining before the break, I want to turn to the nominating process, because that also has become very nationalized, just like the national party organizations have. And I just want to go through some of this very briefly, because our first nominating process for the presidency was the Electoral College. And it's really interesting because, you know, students always get confused about what does the Electoral College mean? Why do we have it? Shouldn't we get rid of it? But the reason it was created was the framers did not want the voters to vote for president. They didn't want Congress to vote for president because Congress would, uh, uh, yeah, okay, I think I admitted somebody waiting. Congress would be not an independent body for the presidency. It could be all kinds of deals struck. They wanted an independent body. They didn't want the state legislatures, but the Electoral College would be chosen by the state legislators. It didn't have to be state legislators. It would be an independent body that is now the oldest body in the world that has never met collectively. They don't meet collectively. They meet in their states, the state electors, they go to their state capital, they cast their votes. The reason Hamilton believed that the Electoral College would chose presidents of character, that the presidency should not be sought by people, that the presidency would be something that would be the seeker, if you will, would seek out those individuals of character. But the reason they created the Electoral College, it was the nominating process. But Hamilton was very clever, or so he thought. That is, each elector would have 2 votes for president. So they'd have a ballot and they would have to write in 2 names. And Hamilton thought that one of the names would be for a local favorite son, and the other name would be for a person of national standing. This worked for George Washington, and John Adams was the runner-up in both those elections. Jefferson got votes from the South for vice president. Adams got votes from the North. But the 2-vote system, the winner with the majority becomes president. The runner-up becomes vice president. It's actually a major reason why the vice presidency was created. So they figured this electoral nominating system would bring people of character into the presidency. And they saw the presidency primarily not as an advocate for specific policies, but as an office of character. So it obviously worked for Washington. And by the way, of character, Hamilton didn't want a president tied to party either. He wanted a civic-minded president that would have the interest of the country at large for first and foremost. This all fell apart after Washington left and after the first Adams election in 1800. Because then what happened is that the Jefferson-Burr race resulted in a tie. At that point, by 1800, the parties had become much stronger. And Democrats did not want to see a vice president under Thomas Jefferson of the opposite party who would be carping against President Jefferson every single day. If we had that system in effect in 2016, Donald Trump would be president and Hillary Clinton would be vice president. And you can imagine how that would work. So Jefferson wanted somebody he thought was going to be simpatico from a state that was decisive in the election of 1800, which was New York. And Burr was the Democratic Party boss of New York. And whoever won New York was going to win the election. And so they forged an alliance. Except that Burr, once the tie happened, said, I can be president. I can win it all. And of course, it came down to the House of Representatives under a tie system where no one has a majority. The House of Representatives has to decide who is president. The House was then controlled by the Federalists, the opposite party And they were deadlocked for ballot after ballot after ballot. And finally, they voted for Jefferson as instructed by Hamilton, who saw Jefferson as the lesser of two evils. And 4 years later, Hamilton and Burr have their famous duel. Hamilton is dead. But they changed the Electoral College to make it one vote for president and vice president. No more two-vote system. When they did that, the whole rationality of the Electoral College was abolished at that point. So this contraption of the Electoral College, is something that we know can misfire, and misfired in 2016, where the popular vote winner doesn't get to be president. And we've tinkered with it and tinkered with it and tinkered with it. And states have done their own tinkering that we can get into. But they wanted the Electoral College to be the national election because of that two-vote system. And most people don't know that. They don't know that's why the whole thing was created to begin with. By 1824, we have another breakdown of the system where the House again has to choose a president. They chose John Quincy Adams, and the popular vote winner, Andrew Jackson, said this was corrupt because Henry Clay, another candidate for president, decided very late in the House vote to back Adams. And the next day, Clay is named Secretary of State, which had been the passageway to the presidency, starting with Jefferson and going right through James Monroe. So Jackson is saying corrupt deal. Jackson is running for president in 1828. He gets a vice president he doesn't like. He wants a more friendly vice president. And so in 1832, he comes up with the idea, which had been actually advanced by a minor party in 1831, to hold a party convention. And that the party convention would, of course, select him, no problem, but select his favorite vice presidential candidate, a guy named Martin Van Buren. And here's a little trivia for you. Martin Van Buren is from a town in New York called Old Kinderhook. And one of the reasons OK came into our English language is due to Martin Van Buren. He was known as Old Kinderhook, or more abbreviated as OK. And it just became part of our lexicon. I like asking students that. Why do we say OK? It's all due to Martin Van Buren. But the conventions came into the fore, and the party organizations, those state and local party organizations, had a great role to play. They were the ones that selected the president. And Democrats came up with a 2/3 rule that wasn't abolished until 1936. You had to get 2/3 of the delegates to be the presidential nominee. And the conventions not only chose the president, but they wanted a party president. They wanted a president that was going to carry out the party platform. And Van Buren writes in his autobiography, he extols parties. Parties are great in the United States. They're responsible because the job of a party is to carry out the party platform. So the conventions really went from 1832 right up to 1968. And they were largely consensual choices by the parties, and candidates often did not win on the first ballot. It was the 1968 convention for the Democrats that was an absolute disaster. So you had controversy in the convention hall over the Vietnam War. Hubert Humphrey, in the words of Theodore White, was nominated in a sea of blood. And now you had riots in the streets of Chicago. That was a huge problem. And so you get the creation of something called the McGovern-Fraser Commission. And what that commission did was it basically said, we need a more nationalized party system, which was sort of the effect of it. Their belief was if the Democratic Party didn't reform significantly, it would die. And so what they did was they basically said, we need the selection of delegates not to be done by state parties, but through state primaries. And they put pressure on the state parties to change their laws to create presidential primaries. And the primary system, when the states did this, they said, well, we're not just going to write primaries for the Democrats, we're going to write primaries for the Republicans as well. And that is exactly what happened. The primaries began to proliferate. And so while you have primaries that were in history, like New Hampshire's primary is very old, so is Wisconsin. They were, in the words of one political scientist, they were like eyewash. No one really paid attention to them. The only reason West Virginia primary mattered in 1960 was to show the party bosses that John F. Kennedy could win in a heavily Protestant state, being a Catholic. That was the only purpose for it. Now the primaries are the means to the nomination. And they have become more nationalized because normally what happens is that winners in places like Iowa and New Hampshire go on to build momentum and win nationally. What happened this year is really interesting because what happened is on the Democratic side is that the Democratic primary voters became party bosses. They basically concluded very early in this process, after South Carolina and then the rise of the pandemic, that their number one priority wasn't policy, it was beating Donald Trump. And they're looking around, who is the candidate who can best beat Donald Trump? And they settled very, very quickly on Joe Biden. And so they did what George Washington Plunkett would do back in the early 20th century. So we see this nationalization of the nominating process that starts with the Electoral College that flops, goes to the party conventions that last a very long time, and now a national primary system that allows also for outsiders. It allowed for George McGovern to win. It allowed for Jimmy Carter to win. It allowed for Donald Trump to win, despite those candidates not being the chosen candidates of their national parties. There's no way the Republican Party organizations in 2016 would have chosen Donald Trump to be their nominee. It just isn't. But because of the nature of the system, the fracturing of the Republican Party then, here we are. So it's an excellent place for me to stop and for you to ask questions. I see a few already, and I'll get right to them. Getting rid of the Electoral College, it's just not happening. We talk about it every time there's a misfire. I don't see it. I don't see it happening. Usually, the Electoral College amplifies the popular vote winner. What the Supreme Court did very recently is important here because they did make, before they concluded their term, a decision on the Electoral College whereby states, if they wish, by law, and some states have done this, penalize party electors for not voting for their candidate, actually fining them. This happened in 2016 in the state of Washington, where a Democratic elector did not vote for Hillary Clinton, was fined $1,000. The court said states can do that. In Maine and Nebraska, those states in 1968 actually changed their laws so that instead of the winner of the popular vote in the state getting all of that state's electoral votes, they changed the law so if you won a congressional district, you would win the vote from that district. That mattered because in 2016, Trump got an electoral vote out of Maine because he won a district in Maine, even though Hillary Clinton won the popular vote statewide. And in Nebraska, the other state, in 2008, Obama got a vote out of Omaha because he won that district. There's polling out today in that district that shows Biden ahead. And so you'll see Biden ads in Nebraska because of their peculiar system. And again, that goes back to 1968. So we've got this nationalization of our parties really at all levels, both organizationally and now at the presidential level. So I'm happy to take other questions if you have. I realize I rushed through some of this, and I can elaborate more if you want. And I just would say this, that we're seeing that nationalization, that's going to continue regardless of what happens in 2016. The parties always tinker with the rules, and every 4 years they make rules changes. But basically, there's no going back to the old convention system. We're seeing this nationalization happen up and down the line across the board. This is a great question about the compact of the national popular vote. So there was a move starting after 2000 and that electoral misfire in Bush v. Gore, where some of the states decided that they would band together and instruct their electors to vote for the popular vote winner. And so some states began to create what they called an electoral vote compact. That compact, though, does not exist because so far enough states with 270 electoral votes have not joined that compact. So it remains an idea in theory. And then there's a question, would a compact actually be valid? And one could foresee that going to the Supreme Court as well. So we've got, a really interesting system. And by the way, the thing in 2020 that makes 2020 so interesting is because of the pandemic, you have vote by mail. It's going to be enormously important this year. We have 50 states with 50 different laws and regulations about how this is going to work. And then you've got issues with counting the votes. So we may well be, and I think it's still likely, unless it's a rout, where we won't know on election night who won the election. We may not know until weeks later. And then there's something called the safe harbor, because early in December, that is when the states have to, the electors from the states have to go to their state capitals to cast their electoral votes. Once they're cast, they are then sent to Washington. They're opened up in early January before a joint session of Congress, and they're actually counted in the House with the Speaker and the Vice President presiding. So do we get to a safe harbor because state election systems are going to be overwhelmed by mail-in ballots? It's going to be it could be a wild ride, people. It just could.
John, if you're not seeing a question, I did have someone submitted one, but it didn't come to you. They sent it to me privately. They probably just clicked on the wrong thing.
No worries.
And it goes back to a very early part of your talk. Do you see any future constraints put on political fundraising, or is this going to continue to grow bigger?
It's going to grow bigger. I don't see the constraints. When you look at what's going on, particularly with super PACs and dark money, this is something that, that well, let me try to put it this way. And it's an analogy I really love with the students, right? So election laws regulate money. And, it's like when it rains and it downpours. Thank God we all have gutters. Gene understands this very well, having lived through some really violent storms recently. But we want that rain to go away from our basements, and we want them to go to our homes, away from our homes, away from our basements. Um, and so election laws are written to regulate the flow of money. Of the amount of money is enormous. And what happens is that we find ways to re-regulate that flow of money. And super PACs and dark money are new ways, basically, to evade existing campaign finance laws. Republicans started that effort really effectively in 1980 because after Watergate, we had very strict regulations on individual contributions and so forth, with candidates for president then accepting federal financing for their general election campaigns, so that they'd be obligated to the taxpayers, not their contributors. The last one to do that was John McCain. Barack Obama was raising money head over fist, so he was going to forego a check from the Treasury. No one's done that since, and there was also provision in the post-Watergate law where you could, the federal government would finance primary candidates provided they showed sufficient support. Well, that's gone by the boards completely because, again, no candidate wants to limit the amount of money that they can raise. So the old post-Watergate statutes that were written to try to combat this have gone by the boards completely. So I don't see that happening. I do see. So I hope that answers the question. Will Congress? Yeah. Okay. This is related. Will Congress write laws to limit dark money? They might. They might. I think they might do something. I think a lot of that really just depends on the outcome of the election. If we have a divided Congress between House and Senate, I don't see that happening. I think that if there is a re-election of President Trump, I don't see it happening. If there is a President Biden in a rout, that could very well happen. And there is certainly strong support to do that within the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. But the pandemic and the economy are certainly going to be first and foremost should the latter scenario of a rout occur. I also see a question about Democratic and Republican Party values. And the question is the Republican Party today more about conserving a country's dollars? That the Democratic Party used to have Republican values that think about conserving money, and is it reversed now, and how did this happen? So the answer to your question, Margarita, is yes, actually. It's interesting that in 1932, Franklin Roosevelt ran on a pledge of balancing the federal budget. 4 years later, he was asked about that speech, and he asked a speechwriter to look at the speech and see if there was any wiggle room. The speechwriter came back to him and said, "Mr. President, the only wiggle room you have is to ever deny you made the speech in the first place." What happened with supply side economics under Reagan is that the budget deficits ballooned. The last balanced budget was under Clinton and the Republicans back in the late 1990s, 2000. We actually ran surpluses. George W. Bush's tax cuts gave that money back and more to the taxpayers, as well as financing 2 wars that weren't paid for. Vice President Dick Cheney at the time said deficits don't matter. And now we've got $1 trillion legislation that's been passed by Congress, more legislation, probably with a T, a trillion, to pass in the next 2 weeks. So right now the pandemic is putting the federal deficit to the back burner, which again is at an all-time high. It is going to be a major problem in the 2020s as the financing consumes more and more of the federal budget, and that's money that is not controllable by the president or Congress. So who is robbing? So who is robbing the American people? Well, it's interesting because, the argument against, certainly the super PACs and the powerful is that you have organizations that, are able to collect and contribute vast sums of money like the NRA that then control the policy agenda in Congress. And one of the questions that's asked is, well, if you have a constituent on the phone, if you're a member and you've got the interest group organization, whose call are you going to take? So in one sense, that's kind of a simplistic answer. The other one, though, is it's actually a little bit more complicated, because what you're seeing is millions of individuals giving $10, $20, $30 to candidates for office. Average contribution, I think, to the Bernie Sanders campaign was $28. And it's like, we're not taking the super PAC or the big money. And you see more and more individuals being more and more engaged and asked to give money, where the campaigns for president, both Trump and now Biden, have these vast mailing lists and are using the internet to organize something that Matt Kerbel is going to talk about this afternoon. So it's not just a question of robbing with a simplistic answer. We as individuals are also more engaged and more willing to open our checkbooks or give candidates our visa information.
So John, there's one more question there, and after that we'll stop.
Okay.
So I don't know whether you want me to read it.
Yeah, I don't see it.
Okay. How do superdelegates fit into the story of the nationalization of parties,
Great.
particularly on the Democratic side?
Superdelegates were a Democratic Party phenomenon. It started after the party's loss in 1980, and what Democrats basically decided was that we needed more of the party regulars to come back into the convention and make a decision. And those superdelegates made the difference for Walter Mondale and nominated. And superdelegates were a factor. These were elected members of Congress, state governors, members of the Democratic National Committee that were not committed to any candidate, but were committed, at least in theory, to nominating somebody that would be good for the party and could win the election. These superdelegates went en masse in 2016 to Hillary Clinton, and they were out there. They didn't have an attraction to Bernie Sanders. They saw Clinton as the best candidate to win. The Sanders people thought the superdelegates were absolutely terrible. Here are the party bosses. Here are the people who are making the decisions and not the voters. And so what happened is that as a price of Sanders' endorsement in 2016, the superdelegates, which numbered about 780 in number, and all about 70 that were for Clinton, Clinton negotiated with Sanders to vastly reduce their numbers down to about 200 and make the superdelegates vote for the primary winner of their state. Because prior to, in 2016 and before, the superdelegates could vote for whoever they wanted. So, for example, Rhode Island, which voted for Bernie Sanders in 2016, their primary, the state governor voted for Hillary Clinton on the convention floor. She saw Clinton as the better candidate. She had the freedom to do that. They don't have that now. The superdelegates aren't coming back, and they don't matter in 2020 because there was such a rapid consolidation behind Biden.
All right, thank you very much, John. And just a thought, John, one of the questions from the teachers, and it's not something we can do now, but as we go along, if you get a chance, for those that you don't know, some of John's books have actually engaged the idea of values in American politics. He's even got one called The New Politics of Old Values. Right.
And the values divide.
Yeah, and exactly, and how the values divide. And there's the book you did with Sandra Hansen. I can't remember the name of that off the top of my head.
The American Dream.
Yeah, that looks at some of this stuff, but it might be some, you know, if we get chances along the way to engage with some of those ideas, because I think in terms of your own scholarly work, that's one thing that sort of stands out. And really, it actually fits with the foundation's mission of, you know, promoting citizenship and civic engagement. But with that, we'll take a break till 1 o'clock. But let me also thank John, because John right now is working without air conditioning. It died on him last night. So he's hopefully having someone come to fix it this afternoon. But it's got to be hot there in Maryland, I bet.
It is.
Yeah.
And I'm so sorry, folks. I may be called away this afternoon, but you're in very good hands with my colleague, Matt Kerbel.
Yeah. So thank you much, and we'll see everybody at 1. If you are having some technical difficulties, just hang on after everybody leaves, and Jen will try to help you out. Okay. And with that, we'll see everybody at 1 o'clock. Take care.